Number 1. The hospital. A lot of neighborhoods have quote-unquote haunted houses in them. You know the kind I mean. There are those houses that are for some reason abandoned and boarded up. No one really seems to know why, and the children all decide that the house is haunted. The older kids make up weird stories about them, just in order to scare their siblings and their friends. It's probably always just a bunch of bullcrap, but it becomes legend with the kids in the neighborhood. My neighborhood had something better. We had an old abandoned hospital. That's all I really knew about it. It had been abandoned for a long time. The kids in the neighborhood claimed it was a mental hospital, but I never really verified that for sure. But we had a little town legend about it, at least amongst the kids. The story goes that this was a mental hospital, and when they closed it down, the patients were released back into society. One of the patients, a man they simply called Lucky, not the cleverest nickname, but there you have it, considered the place to be his home, and he returned to live in it years afterward. He supposedly lived in the basement, and would try to kill anyone who ever entered his home. The kids in the neighborhood would always dare each other to break in and spend time in the old hospital. No one would ever actually do it, though. I'd been dared before. The closest I ever got on a dare was climbing over the gate. Once I was on the other side, though, I'm not too proud to admit that I chickened out and climbed back over. There was one kid in the neighborhood that did take the dare, though. So this story is not a first-hand account of what happened inside the hospital. But it's almost scary to me not knowing what really happened. When I was a high school freshman on Halloween, a bunch of us headed down to the hospital to go about the usual daring. As usual, some of us would go up to the gate, begin to climb over, and then chicken out. One kid I didn't really know well named Tom, though, was teasing us all mercilessly for being chicken. He kept telling us that the stories about Lucky were a bunch of baloney and we were dumb for being so scared. When about 6 of us had chickened out and gotten teased by this guy, we finally had had enough of his crap. We told Tom that unless he was willing to do what he was criticizing us for not doing, then he needed to shut the hell up. We were wrong in assuming that Tom was going to chicken out, though. He readily accepted our challenge and began to climb over the gate. He got over the gate and jumped down on the other side. Then he waved at us and walked over to the door of the hospital. He actually tried opening the door, and that was more than any of us had ever tried before. It didn't work. The door was locked. This actually gave Tom the chance to back out, but he didn't. After looking around for a bit, he found a large rock and used it to shatter one of the windows. We all got worried because we thought the noise would attract somebody, but that didn't happen. Tom broke the glass out of the basement window, and then he carefully lowered himself inside the window and out of sight. We were all pretty shocked and a bit ashamed of ourselves as well. But the shame that we felt in no way compared to the paranoia that settled in on us as we waited for Tom to come back out. At first, we were just impressed that he had gone in. Then, we were even more impressed that he stayed in there for quite a while. That feeling of being impressed, though, began to fade into worry the longer that Tom did not come out of that hospital. It was bad enough when it had been an hour. It was worse when it was 2 hours. It became absolutely dreadful to us when nearly 4 hours had passed and Tom still had not come out of the hospital. It began to really bug us because we weren't sure why he hadn't come back out, but we definitely speculated on it. Our first thought that he was taking his time to simply try and scare us. But the worst thought, and the one that became more and more realistic to us as time went on, was that Tom must have come across Lucky, and Lucky must have been unhappy to have someone invading his home. Tom's disappearance also put us all in a really bad place. We were not supposed to be hanging out at that old hospital. If Tom didn't come back out at some point, we would have to go to our parents or the police. And neither of those choices were going to be easy. When Tom didn't emerge, we went directly to the police. We probably should have went to our parents first, because when the cops called our parents out of the blue, the situation just got worse. I know I got chewed out in front of all the cops and in front of all the other parents as well. While the chewing out was bad, what happened when the cops went to the hospital to look for Tom was much worse. They searched the entire hospital, the basement, the rooms, the hallways, everything. And there was no trace of Tom or anybody else. The police figured he just exited the building somewhere else, and he left us waiting on the outside for him. Although Tom hadn't returned home, the police told his parents that he was probably just playing out his prank. But Tom didn't return that night. Tom didn't return the next day. Tom didn't return the next week. Search parties looked for him in the town, but he wasn't there. The hospital was searched more than once, and nothing was found. No Tom. No Lucky. No indication, other than the window that Tom broke, that anybody had been in the hospital at all. Posters with Tom's picture were put up at the post office and in the stores, but he never showed up. This happened in the 1970s, and to this day, I have no idea what happened. Tom was never found. The guilt I have felt throughout the years is pretty bad, but it's not nearly as bad as the wondering. I never saw Tom again, and I really don't know what happened to him when he went into that abandoned hospital. Number 2. The Barn. I grew up living out in the country. My parents had a house that was set in a hollow and surrounded by tons of hills and forest. Even though I used to spend a lot of time exploring the hills, I was always able to find new places each time. It was great. During the fall when I was 12, I went out for a good adventure. It was brisk outside, so I made sure I had a jacket on. The leaves had already turned for the fall, and the countryside was absolutely beautiful. I got started pretty early in the afternoon because it got dark really early, and the last thing I wanted was to get caught in the dark, out in the woods. I had been hiking for a few hours through the forest when I began going downhill. At the bottom of the hill, there was a huge, treeless field. I had never seen it before, and I was really fascinated. But even more interesting to me was the huge barn that I saw sitting in the middle of the field. Finding abandoned barns out in the hills was not an unheard of experience. I often came across many really old and abandoned buildings that had been buried in the trees and the bushes. This was different though. This was enormous, and it was easily the biggest barn I'd ever seen in my life. Very excited, I headed down towards the barn. I noticed that the sun had descended a bit in the sky, and I cursed myself for not getting out of the house earlier. As it was, it seemed that no matter how little time I spent exploring the barn, it would be dark by the time I got home. I figured it would be worth it though. I didn't really expect to find anything interesting inside the barn, but it would still be a bit of adventure for me. I didn't realize how huge the barn was until I was actually standing right outside of it. It was enormous. It was easily as high as a 5-story building. The boards were old, and the entire building itself was gray. The boards were weathered down pretty bad. There wasn't much wear and tear other than that though. I stood in front of the huge front doors, which looked pretty solid as well. I wasn't even sure if I was going to be able to open them. I looked around, starting to get slightly nervous that someone who owned the land the barn was on might be around. I was in a pretty large and far-out area, and would have been able to see if anyone was around though. The barn likely had been empty for years, and maybe decades, so there really wasn't much for me to be afraid of. However, tell that to a 12-year-old boy who was just trying to explore, and had an active and vivid imagination. I opened the door, which wasn't locked, which also wasn't surprising. I pulled it open enough for me to slip into the barn. Once I got inside, it was even more awesome than I thought it was. The interior of the barn was wide open and just plain enormous. There were many different lofts which were accessible by trapdoors and ladders, and there was hay everywhere. Tons of tools such as pitchforks and sickles hung on the walls. I searched around the barn, just feeling like this was the coolest place I'd ever been in. After looking around for a bit, I found something else that was even cooler. As I was walking around, my foot hit something under the hay. When I brushed the hay aside, I noticed that I'd hit the handle of a trapdoor. This was very exciting, and I proceeded to clear the hay off the door, and then tried to open the trapdoor. It took a bit of effort to open the trapdoor. When I did get it open, I stood there in shock. In the room under the door, there were 3 people. 3 skinny and naked people. And they weren't just skinny, they were emaciated. And when they saw me, 2 of them started hissing at me. The third one looked at me, pure hate and anger reflected in his eyes. He screamed at me, "Close the motherfucking door!" I wasn't able to move at first, though. I was so utterly shocked that I just didn't know what to do. I just stood there like an idiot, holding the trap door. The 2 people who had hissed at me sank deeper into the darkness of the hole. But the third, the angry one who had yelled at me, sneered. He then got over to the ladder and began ascending it at an alarming speed. I didn't even have time to close the damn door. I just freaked and took off for the entrance to the barn. Looking back as I was going out the door, The third person had actually gotten out of the room and closed the door, but he didn't go back in. He came running after me. My 12-year-old legs have never run faster before or since. I squeezed out of the door and began running for the woods. Although it wasn't dark outside yet, the sun had gone down enough that it wasn't very bright. I looked back a couple times before I got to the trees, and I saw the guy coming at me before I made it back up the hill. But once I got back to the trees, I didn't waste any more time looking back. It got completely dark long before I got home. It was a nightmare, walking through the forest in the dark, wondering if that person was still out there. Every sound I heard, every crunched leaf, every snapping of every twig, and I jumped. I felt like I was being watched and followed. It was a nightmare. When I got back to my house, I climbed over the barbed wire fence and into my yard. Once there, I booked it until I got into the door, and then I locked it. I told my parents what I had seen. They didn't really believe me. My mom told me I needed to stop making up stories. My dad told me that even if I had seen such a thing, I had no business going into the barn to begin with. Obviously, the people weren't being held there against their will. He said that a lot of weird stuff happened out in the woods, and it was best if I just forgot about it. But how could I forget about it? When I slept in my room at night, my eyes were always focused on my window. I always expected to look up and see that person, skinny as hell, looking in at me, his eyes inflamed with rage and hate. I always felt like I was being watched all the time. Don't ever go into an abandoned building. Number 3. The Animal Shelter. There was an old abandoned cat shelter outside of town. It garnered quite a reputation concerning why it had closed down. The prevailing but ludicrous story was that they allowed a stray cat in there that had some sort of rare, flesh-eating disease. They weren't able to screen for it, and therefore they were not able to detect it before putting the cat in with all the other cats. All the cats supposedly died, and the shelter lost all of its funding as a result, and was forced to shut down. Some people even claim that there were tons of dead cat bodies in the building, just because they didn't clean it out before they left. Well, obviously that story was just made up. It was so far over the top that no one with half a brain would actually believe it. But it did lend an air of mystery and foreboding about the abandoned building. I used to always be really curious about the shelter, and wanted to go in and see what it was like inside. I knew it would probably just be boring, but I wouldn't know for sure unless I checked it out first. So one night, I finally got the nerve to break into the building. I had to wait until it was around midnight because I didn't want to worry about being seen by other people. It was creepy approaching the building in the dark, but I had a flashlight. I had to search around, but I found a broken window in the back of the building to climb into. This was convenient because I didn't really want to cause any more damage to the building. Last thing I needed was a vandalism charge on a broken old rundown building. Once I had gotten inside, I began looking around in the various rooms. Much like I had originally expected, The shelter was not as interesting in reality as it was in theory. There was a lot of old furniture, some shelves and stuff, but there were no bodies of dead cats lying around. There wasn't anything that indicated in any way why the place had closed down. It was just an old, broken down building. As I was exploring, I heard a noise coming from down the hallway. Looking down in that direction, it was coming from a room that was made to be a huge cat playroom. It had a big cat tree and was closed off by a screen. I was curious, thinking that maybe a cat or some other sort of animal was in there, and I wanted to check it out. I entered the area around the screened-in part, and I shone my flashlight all over the area. After not really seeing much of anything at first, I saw something move under the cat tree. I immediately shone my light on it, and it looked like a blanket with something moving under it. I moved closer to the screen, figuring I was safe because whatever I was looking at was way in the middle of the play area under the cat tree. But there was definitely something moving under that blanket, or whatever it was. I kept looking at it, trying to figure out what was going on. It was then that I noticed the blanket being pulled slightly to the side, and I saw a human's eyes peeking out at me. He looked right into the flashlight, and he probably wasn't able to make out much about me. But when he saw me, he pulled down the blanket and scowled at me. "Stay away from my kitties!" the man screamed at me. "Leave my kitties alone!" He got up and threw the blanket to the side. The man ran up to the screen, causing me to step back and trip in shock. I fell right on my ass. The man pressed his face and his body up against the screen. His lips pressed deeply into the mesh, and he repeated, "Leave my kitties alone!" I could see him slobbering all over the screen as he pressed against it. It was then that I noticed he was holding what looked like a dead body of an animal which I assumed to be a cat, in one hand, vigorously petting it with the other hand as he yelled at me. It may have been something else, I really don't know, maybe even a moldy stuffed animal. It was hard to tell, but I really didn't wait around to find out. He didn't seem like he was trying to break the screen down, but I really didn't want to take the chance that he was going to do that. So I jumped off my ass, took off running out the door. As I ran back to the window I had crawled into, I heard the man yelling at me, telling me to leave his kitties alone. It was freaky. I heard the man's voice behind me, even as I was crawling through the window. After I got out, I could still hear him screaming and crying, but I just ran as far away from that place as I could. Although the experience wasn't life-altering scary, it was pretty creepy when it happened. The man was obviously disturbed, and that was the worst part of it. It was nice to know that the animal shelter was simply just an abandoned building. I figured the guy was just a homeless man who moved in, but he obviously let the place get to him. Good evening. I really hope you all enjoyed these stories. If you did, don't forget to hit the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please hit the button next to the tabby to subscribe. This will keep you informed of the addition of new content. I actually have credits this time. The first story about the hospital was submitted by Ted Massey. Thank you very much for that story, Ted. It was very creepy. The barn story was submitted by Jordan, who wished to have his last name withheld. Thank you both, because those stories were excellent, and thank you to the submitter of the anonymous animal shelter story. That was very good as well. Now, even though I congratulated him on his page, I want to congratulate Joey's Nightmares on reaching the 1,000 subscriber barrier. Our mutual friend Blue Spooky is rapidly approaching that level as well. I want to thank any of my viewers who have supported my friends' channels. It really means a lot to me to see people succeed, and these two guys really deserve it. It makes me very happy to see their channels growing. I also want to thank all of you for your continued support. And before you go to bed, make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where the killer orange cat might be hiding. Good night.